Take off the costume, old man. The words cut through the steady rain like a blade of cold steel, sharp enough to make every passing driver glance toward the flashing patrol lights on the shoulder of Interstate 85. Officer Ethan Cole stood beside a dark gray Lincoln sedan, one hand resting on his duty belt, the other pointing toward a neatly folded black robe lying across the back seat. Rainwater rolled down the vehicle's windows in silver streams, distorting the reflections of red and blue emergency lights that danced across the wet pavement. The evening sky hung low over Charlotte, North Carolina, wrapped in thick storm clouds that swallowed the last traces of daylight. Inside the vehicle, Marcus Whitfield sat perfectly still. At 52 years old, his posture remained straight despite the tension in the air. His charcoal suit was immaculate. His silver tie remained perfectly centered. The calm expression on his face seemed almost untouched by the hostility standing outside his door. "Sir, I'm asking you one more time," Ethan said, his voice carrying the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Step out of the vehicle and stop pretending." Marcus slowly turned his head toward the young officer. Water drummed softly against the roof of the car. Trucks roared past only yards away, sending sprays of mist into the air. "Officer," Marcus replied evenly, "my identification is in my wallet. If you would simply review it, I believe this misunderstanding can be resolved." Ethan laughed. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to signal contempt. "A misunderstanding?" His eyes shifted back to the robe. "You expect me to believe that?" Marcus followed his gaze. The black robe remained neatly folded where he had placed it after leaving a legal symposium earlier that afternoon. "That robe belongs to me," Marcus said calmly. "Sure it does." Ethan shook his head and stepped back from the door. "You know, I've seen people pretend to be doctors. I've seen people pretend to be military officers. But this," he pointed again toward the robe, "this might be the most creative one yet." The rain intensified, tapping harder against metal and glass. Nearby, a white SUV slowed as its driver glanced toward the scene before continuing down the highway. Marcus remained composed. He neither raised his voice nor showed frustration. Instead, he folded his hands together and waited. That calmness irritated Ethan more than any argument could have. Most people became nervous during traffic stops. Most people rushed to explain themselves. Most people reacted. Marcus Whitfield simply sat there, watching the storm. Ethan leaned closer to the open window. "Let me guess," he said. "You bought the robe online. Maybe you wear it to parties." Marcus looked directly into his eyes. "Officer, I assure you, this situation is not what you think it is." For a brief moment, silence settled between them. Only the sound of rainfall filled the space. Then Ethan smiled. It was the kind of smile that came from certainty, from believing the story had already been written and the ending was already known. What he could not see was that 10 minutes from now, that certainty would begin to unravel beneath the same flashing lights that now reflected across the flooded highway. The rain continued to fall across Interstate 85 as if the sky itself had settled into a long, patient silence. Inside the sedan, Marcus Whitfield remained composed while water streaked down the windshield in shifting patterns of silver and gray. Few people looking at him now would have guessed how far he had traveled to reach this moment in life. Marcus had not grown up surrounded by privilege. He had been raised in a modest neighborhood outside Durham, North Carolina, where his mother worked double shifts at a county hospital and his father spent 30 years repairing city buses. Their small brick home sat beside a narrow street lined with maple trees and cracked sidewalks. It was not wealth that shaped Marcus. It was discipline. It was respect. It was the belief that character mattered even when nobody was watching. As a teenager, Marcus often studied beneath a flickering kitchen light long after midnight while the rest of the neighborhood slept. Years later, those long nights carried him through law school, then through the state courts, and eventually onto the federal bench. Yet despite the title attached to his name, those closest to him knew he never viewed himself as more important than anyone else. Earlier that afternoon, he had spoken before a group of young attorneys attending a legal ethics conference in downtown Charlotte. The ballroom had been filled with recent graduates, public defenders, and aspiring judges. Marcus had spent nearly an hour answering questions about fairness, accountability, and public trust. Many remained afterward just to shake his hand. Some asked for advice. Others thanked him for becoming the kind of role model they rarely saw growing up. By the time the event ended, the storm had already begun rolling across the city. Heavy clouds swallowed the skyline. Wind rattled the glass towers downtown. Marcus folded his judicial robe carefully after the final photograph and placed it in the back seat before beginning the 70-mile drive home. He had planned to spend the evening quietly. A cup of coffee, a legal brief waiting on his desk, perhaps a phone call with his daughter, who was finishing medical school in Atlanta. It was supposed to be an ordinary night. Instead, flashing patrol lights now reflected across every surface around him. Outside, Officer Ethan Cole walked slowly around the vehicle, studying it with the confidence of someone convinced he had already figured everything out. Marcus watched him through the rain-speckled glass. Ethan appeared young, perhaps in his early 30s. Strong posture, crisp uniform, the kind of officer who had learned procedure but not yet patience. Marcus had encountered people like him before. Men who mistook authority for certainty. Men who believed confidence alone could replace careful judgment. The federal judge understood something Ethan did not. The most dangerous assumptions often arrived wearing the face of certainty. A tractor trailer thundered past, sending a wave of mist across the shoulder. Ethan stopped beside the rear door and glanced again at the folded robe. His expression hardened. Whatever conclusion he had reached, he seemed determined to hold on to it. Marcus released a slow breath and rested his hands calmly in his lap. Over the years, he had presided over thousands of cases. He had watched witnesses panic, lawyers lose composure, defendants make decisions they later regretted. Experience had taught him a simple lesson. Truth rarely needed to shout. Sometimes it only needed time. And as the rain continued to fall beneath the glow of emergency lights, time was quietly moving in Marcus Whitfield's favor. Officer Ethan Cole had built his career on quick decisions. In 6 years with the department, supervisors often praised his confidence, his productivity, and his willingness to take charge. Those compliments had become something he carried everywhere, like an invisible badge layered on top of the one pinned to his uniform. What nobody seemed to notice was how rarely he questioned his first impression of someone. To Ethan, instinct felt like evidence. Assumption felt like experience. And tonight, standing beside the rain-soaked sedan, he was convinced his instincts were guiding him toward the truth. He stepped back toward his patrol vehicle and opened the driver's side door. The radio crackled with distant traffic updates and routine dispatch calls. Everything sounded ordinary. Yet Ethan felt strangely energized. He believed he had uncovered someone attempting to deceive law enforcement, and that belief fueled every decision he made. Across the highway, headlights moved through the darkness in endless streams of white and red. The storm continued to sweep across Charlotte, pushing sheets of rain against guardrails and road signs. Ethan glanced once more toward Marcus Whitfield. The older man remained calm inside the vehicle. No raised voice, no frantic gestures, no signs of panic. Instead of making Ethan reconsider, that composure only deepened his suspicion. In his mind, confidence from someone he had already judged as dishonest could only mean one thing. The act was well practiced. Ethan walked back toward the sedan and tapped lightly on the glass. Marcus lowered the window another inch. Cool air mixed with the scent of rain and wet asphalt. "You seem awfully relaxed," Ethan said. Marcus looked at him steadily. "Should I be upset for cooperating?" Ethan ignored the question. "Most people would be nervous right now." Marcus offered a faint smile. "Most people are not the same person." The answer lingered in the air. Ethan frowned. Something about the man's quiet certainty bothered him. He wanted uncertainty. He wanted hesitation. Instead, he kept finding patience. Meanwhile, nearly 20 miles away, a conference organizer named Rebecca Langley sat in a hotel lobby gathering leftover event materials. Stacks of name tags, folders, and programs covered a long table near the entrance. As she reviewed the attendance list, one name caught her attention. Honorable Marcus Whitfield. Rebecca glanced at her watch. The judge should have arrived home by now. Earlier that evening, he had promised to email several mentoring resources for young attorneys. Marcus was known for following through on every commitment. Rebecca smiled as she packed another folder. Somewhere out on the highway, she assumed, he was probably driving through the storm with the same steady patience he had shown throughout the conference. Back on Interstate 85, Ethan circled the sedan again. The folded robe remained visible through the rear window. Water droplets shimmered across the glass beneath the flashing emergency lights. To Ethan, it still looked like a prop, a costume, a symbol of a life he believed Marcus could not possibly have earned. He folded his arms and stared at the vehicle. The rain drummed harder. Wind swept across the shoulder. And while Ethan stood there feeling more certain than ever, the truth sat only a few feet away, waiting quietly for the moment when certainty would collide with reality. The storm showed no sign of easing. Rain swept across the highway in long silver sheets while emergency lights painted flashes of blue and red across the flooded shoulder. Officer Ethan Cole stood beside the sedan with growing confidence, convinced that every passing minute confirmed his judgment. He pulled a small flashlight from his belt and shined it through the rear window again. The black robe remained folded neatly on the seat. To Marcus Whitfield, it represented decades of service, sacrifice, and responsibility. To Ethan, it looked like evidence supporting a story he had already constructed in his mind. Marcus sat quietly, watching droplets race down the glass. He knew experience had taught him something many people never learned. Once a person becomes committed to a false conclusion, facts alone rarely change their mind. Time usually does. Ethan returned to the driver's window. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness between them. "I am giving you another opportunity," he said. "Tell me the truth now and make this easier on yourself." Marcus met his gaze. "I have been telling the truth from the beginning." Ethan shook his head. "You keep saying that. Because it remains true." The answer only seemed to frustrate the officer further. Nearby, another vehicle slowed briefly before continuing down the interstate. A passenger raised a phone toward the scene for a moment, curious about the flashing lights and the unusual sight of an officer standing in the rain beside a luxury sedan. Ethan noticed and straightened his posture. He suddenly felt as though people were watching. In a way, they were. A small audience of strangers was forming through passing windshields. "Step out of the vehicle," Ethan said firmly. Marcus remained respectful. "Officer, before we continue, I would appreciate if you reviewed my identification." Ethan folded his arms. "You really think a fake card is going to solve this?" Marcus did not answer immediately. The rain tapped softly against the roof. Wind rattled the nearby guardrail. Finally he spoke. "I think facts usually solve most problems." Ethan let out a short laugh. "That sounds like something somebody rehearsed." Yet even as he spoke, a small doubt flickered somewhere beneath his confidence. Marcus did not look like a man pretending to be someone else. He did not sound nervous. He did not appear confused. His composure remained steady, almost impossible to shake. Instead of questioning his assumptions, Ethan pushed the doubt away. He had come too far to reconsider now. Nearly 30 miles away, traffic crawled through downtown Charlotte as conference attendees made their way home through the storm. Several young attorneys were still discussing Marcus Whitfield's presentation. One woman opened her phone and reread notes she had taken during his speech. A sentence stood out. "Respect for the law begins with respect for people." She smiled and saved the document before heading into the rain. Back on Interstate 85, Marcus sat beneath the glow of emergency lights, unaware that people across the city were still talking about the message he had delivered only hours earlier. Ironically, he was now living that lesson himself. Ethan took another step toward the sedan. The storm reflected in his uniform. Water dripped from the brim of his patrol cap. "You know what your problem is?" he asked. Marcus looked up calmly. Ethan pointed toward the back seat. "You thought nobody would question the story." Marcus glanced briefly at the robe before returning his attention to the officer. "No," he replied quietly. "My mistake was believing someone would be willing to verify it." For the first time that evening, Ethan had no immediate response. The words settled heavily between them while the rain continued falling around both men. The silence that followed Marcus Whitfield's last sentence seemed louder than the storm itself. Rain hammered against the interstate while headlights carved bright tunnels through the darkness. For several seconds, Officer Ethan Cole simply stood there beside the sedan. The older man's words lingered in his mind in a way he could not explain. Most people argued. Most people protested. Most people tried desperately to convince him. Marcus did none of those things. He remained calm, seated behind the wheel, watching the rain slide across the windshield as though he had already accepted that truth moved on its own schedule. Ethan looked away first. He turned toward his patrol vehicle and opened the door. The radio hissed with static before dispatch answered another unit somewhere across the county. He climbed inside and began typing notes into the onboard computer. The glow from the screen illuminated his face while raindrops streaked across the side window. He entered details about the stop, documenting his growing suspicions. Each sentence felt reasonable to him. Each conclusion seemed justified. Yet the longer he typed, the more difficult it became to ignore a simple fact. He still had not verified the identification Marcus repeatedly offered. Outside, another vehicle slowed as it passed. Then another. Several drivers glanced toward the unusual scene. Emergency lights continued flashing across the wet highway. The image of a respected older black man sitting alone in the storm while being treated like a suspect would have looked troubling to anyone watching from a distance. But Ethan remained convinced appearances could be deceiving. His phone suddenly vibrated. A message from a fellow officer appeared on the screen asking if he planned to join a gathering after his shift. Ethan ignored it. His attention returned to the sedan. Something about Marcus bothered him, not because the man seemed threatening, but because he seemed completely unshaken. Confidence was supposed to belong to the officer controlling the situation. Yet somehow the balance felt different tonight. Marcus sat quietly while the storm raged around him. Inside the sedan, he thought about the countless people who had stood before him in court over the years. Some had been innocent. Some had been guilty. Nearly all had wanted the same thing: to be seen fairly, to be judged by facts rather than assumptions. He found himself wondering whether Ethan understood the weight of that responsibility. A sudden gust of wind rattled a nearby road sign. Water sprayed across the shoulder. The storm seemed determined to test everything standing beneath it. Ethan stepped back out of the patrol vehicle. Rain immediately soaked his sleeves. He approached the driver's window once more. This time his expression carried less certainty and more frustration. "You know what I do not understand?" he asked. Marcus looked up calmly. "What is that?" Ethan hesitated. "Why you are not angry?" Marcus glanced toward the flashing lights reflecting across the pavement. Anger would not change the facts. Ethan frowned. Most people would be furious. Most people are not responsible for making decisions that affect other lives every day. The answer landed harder than Ethan expected. For a brief moment, neither man spoke. The rain filled the silence between them. Then dispatch crackled through Ethan's shoulder radio. A supervisor was requesting an update. Ethan reached for the microphone, unaware that the next few minutes would change everything. He began explaining the situation exactly as he believed it existed. And with every word he spoke, he moved one step closer to a truth he was not prepared to face. The supervisor's voice faded from Ethan Cole's radio, leaving only the soft hiss of static and the endless rhythm of rain striking metal and pavement. For the first time that night, neither man spoke. The interstate stretched into darkness beyond the flashing lights, its lanes shimmering beneath a blanket of water. Traffic had thinned. The storm had driven most people home. What remained was a strange pocket of silence suspended between two very different lives. Marcus Whitfield leaned back slightly in his seat and watched droplets gather at the edge of the windshield before sliding away into the night. The red and blue reflections outside moved across the glass like distant waves. He had spent decades inside courtrooms where tension filled the air before important decisions. This felt surprisingly familiar, not because of the circumstances, but because of the waiting. Real truth often arrived quietly. It rarely announced itself. It simply appeared when assumptions finally ran out of room. Ethan stood beside his patrol vehicle with his arms folded against the cold. Rain darkened his uniform. Water dripped steadily from the brim of his cap. He should have felt satisfied. According to his own reasoning, he had handled the stop correctly. Yet the feeling never came. Instead, an unfamiliar discomfort settled into his chest. He found himself replaying every exchange from the past 30 minutes. Every answer Marcus had given. Every opportunity offered to verify the identification. Every calm response to an accusation. The more he replayed them, the less certain he felt. Across the highway, a row of distant lights from a shopping center glowed through the rain. Their reflections stretched across the wet asphalt like broken ribbons of gold. Marcus noticed them and thought of home. He imagined the warm lamp beside his desk, the stack of legal briefs waiting for review, the framed family photograph sitting near the window. Ordinary things, peaceful things. He had learned long ago that true success was not measured by titles. It was measured by the ability to remain grounded when circumstances tried to pull you somewhere else. A gust of wind swept across the shoulder. The patrol lights flickered against the rain. Ethan glanced toward the sedan again. Marcus remained exactly where he had been, patient and composed. There was no anger in his expression, no bitterness. That bothered Ethan more than any argument could have. He was accustomed to conflict. He knew how to respond to shouting. He understood resistance. What he did not understand was dignity that refused to disappear under pressure. Several miles away, thunder rolled across the Charlotte skyline. The storm moved slowly eastward, dragging heavy clouds behind it. Back on the interstate, the world seemed to narrow to rain, light, and silence. Marcus closed his eyes briefly and listened. Water striking pavement, engines humming in the distance, wind brushing against the side of the vehicle. In that quiet moment, he felt no need to defend himself further. The facts already existed. They did not require his permission. They did not require his effort. They simply waited. And somewhere beyond the curtain of rain, unseen by either man, another set of headlights had just entered the highway, moving steadily toward the scene and carrying the first pieces of a truth that was finally beginning to catch up. The approaching headlights emerged through the rain like pale stars cutting across a dark ocean. Ethan Cole barely noticed them at first. He remained standing beside his patrol vehicle, watching water stream across the shoulder of the interstate, while uncertainty quietly pressed against the confidence he had carried all evening. The headlights grew brighter. A dark county vehicle slowed behind the patrol car before coming to a stop. Its tires hissed against the wet pavement. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the driver's door opened. Lieutenant Sarah Bennett stepped out into the rain. She was a 20-year veteran of the department, respected for her calm judgment and unwillingness to jump to conclusions. The storm immediately soaked the shoulders of her jacket as she walked toward Ethan. "What have we got?" she asked. Ethan straightened. The arrival of a supervisor restored some of his confidence. He quickly explained his version of events, speaking over the sound of rainfall and distant traffic. Sarah listened without interrupting. When he finished, she glanced toward the sedan. "Did you verify identification?" Ethan hesitated. The pause lasted less than a second, but it was enough. Sarah's expression changed. "Did you?" she repeated. "Not yet," Ethan admitted. The lieutenant looked at him for a long moment. Rain rolled from the brim of her cap. Then she walked toward the driver's side window. Marcus lowered the glass slightly. Cool air drifted into the cabin. For the first time that evening, someone approached him without assumptions already written across their face. "Good evening, sir," Sarah said politely. "I am Lieutenant Bennett. May I see your identification?" Marcus nodded. "Of course." He slowly retrieved his wallet and handed over a leather identification holder. Sarah opened it beneath the glow of her flashlight. The moment her eyes reached the first line, her posture changed. The color seemed to drain from her face. She looked down again, making certain she had read it correctly. Then she looked up at Marcus. "Your Honor," she said quietly. The words disappeared beneath the rain, but Ethan heard them. Every muscle in his body seemed to freeze. Sarah opened the holder again. The credentials were unmistakable. Federal Judicial Identification. Official seal. Full name: Honorable Marcus Whitfield, United States Federal Judge. The silence that followed felt endless. Rain continued falling. Traffic continued moving. Yet everything around Ethan suddenly seemed distant. The robe in the back seat no longer looked like a costume. The calm demeanor no longer looked suspicious. Every assumption he had built over the last hour began collapsing under the weight of a single verified fact. Sarah stepped back from the window. Her expression carried a mixture of shock and disappointment. Ethan stared at the identification in her hand as though seeing it from another world. Marcus remained seated exactly as before. No triumphant smile. No anger. No celebration. Only quiet patience. The same patience he had shown since the beginning. Ethan opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. For the first time that night, certainty had abandoned him completely. And standing beneath the flashing lights and relentless rain, he realized the truth had been sitting only a few feet away all along. Rain continued falling across Interstate 85, but something fundamental had changed. The storm was no longer the center of the scene. The truth was, Lieutenant Sarah Bennett stood beside the sedan holding the identification carefully, as though it carried far more weight than a simple card. In many ways, it did. She handed it back through the partially open window. "I apologize for the delay, Your Honor," she said respectfully. Marcus accepted it with a small nod. "Thank you, Lieutenant." Her words seemed simple, yet they landed heavily in the silence surrounding them. A few feet away, Ethan Cole remained motionless. The confidence that had fueled him for most of the evening was gone. In its place stood something far less comfortable. Doubt, reflection, regret. Sarah turned toward him. "Walk with me for a moment." Her voice remained calm, but the disappointment underneath it was impossible to miss. They moved a short distance away from the sedan while rain tapped steadily against the highway. Marcus stayed where he was, looking out through the windshield at the blurred lights stretching into the darkness. He made no effort to listen. He simply waited. Sarah lowered her voice. "You never verified identification." Ethan swallowed. "No, ma'am. You made assumptions before gathering facts." He stared at the pavement. "Yes, ma'am." Sarah studied him for several seconds. Then her expression changed. Not softer, more concerned. "There is something else you need to know." Ethan looked up. "What do you mean?" The lieutenant hesitated briefly before speaking. 3 weeks ago, Internal Affairs opened a review regarding several citizen complaints. Ethan's stomach tightened immediately. Complaints. Complaints involving traffic stops, conduct concerns, and allegations of bias. Rainwater rolled down the side of her face. The review package was scheduled for legal evaluation. Ethan felt the cold air suddenly become much colder. Legal evaluation by who? Sarah held his gaze. By Judge Marcus Whitfield's court. The words struck harder than any reprimand could have. For a moment, Ethan simply stared at her. The sound of traffic seemed to disappear entirely. All he could hear was rain. The irony felt almost impossible. The very person he had spent the evening refusing to believe was the same person whose court had already been connected to a review of his professional conduct. Sarah continued. "No findings have been issued. No conclusions have been reached. But the review exists." Ethan slowly looked back toward the sedan. Through the rain-speckled glass, he could see Marcus sitting quietly behind the wheel. Not angry, not vindictive, just patient. The realization unsettled him more than anything else that night. If their positions had been reversed, he was not sure he would have shown the same restraint. Sarah followed his gaze. "Do you know what stands out most about this situation?" she asked. Ethan said nothing. He gave you every opportunity to verify the facts. Another silence followed. Long, uncomfortable, honest. Finally, Ethan nodded. "I know." Back inside the sedan, Marcus watched rain slide across the windshield in soft silver trails. He had no idea what conversation was taking place behind him. He only knew that storms always ended eventually. The same was true for misunderstanding. The same was true for pride. And as the flashing lights reflected across the wet highway, one lesson was becoming impossible for anyone there to ignore. Authority could command attention, but only humility could reveal the truth. 3 months later, sunlight poured through the tall windows of the federal courthouse in Charlotte, casting long bands of gold across polished marble floors. The storm from that night on Interstate 85 had long since passed, but its lessons had not. The courthouse moved with its usual rhythm. Attorneys carried folders through hallways. Clerks exchanged quiet greetings. Elevators opened and closed with soft mechanical chimes. Yet inside courtroom 4, an unusual silence hung in the air. Marcus Whitfield sat behind the bench reviewing documents beneath the seal of the United States. His black robe rested naturally across his shoulders now, no longer folded on a back seat, no longer questioned, no longer mistaken for something it was not. The room carried the calm weight of responsibility. Every polished surface reflected the morning light. Every chair stood neatly aligned. Every detail seemed to reinforce a simple truth. Institutions mattered, but the people inside them mattered even more. Near the rear of the courtroom sat Ethan Cole. His uniform was gone. Today he wore a dark suit and a simple tie. He was attending a mandatory professional ethics seminar as part of departmental corrective training. Several other officers sat nearby taking notes. Nobody paid special attention to him. Nobody needed to. Ethan's attention remained fixed on the front of the room. 3 months earlier, he had believed confidence alone could guide every decision. Since then, difficult conversations, internal reviews, and long hours of reflection had forced him to confront something far more uncomfortable than criticism. Himself. Marcus finished reviewing the final page before looking up. His expression remained calm, exactly as it had on the side of the interstate. Tom had not changed that. Experience had built it. The seminar focused on public trust, procedural fairness, and professional responsibility. Topics Marcus had spent much of his career discussing. Topics that seemed abstract until one moment transformed them into something personal. As the session neared its conclusion, a young officer raised a hand. "Your Honor," he asked, "what is the most important quality someone in authority can have?" The room grew still. Marcus folded his hands together. For a moment, he seemed to consider the question carefully. Sunlight reflected softly across the bench. Dust drifted through the golden air near the windows. Finally, he spoke. "Humility." The single word settled across the courtroom. "Authority gives people power," Marcus continued. "Humility reminds them why that power exists." No one interrupted. No one looked away. Even Ethan remained motionless. Marcus glanced across the room. His eyes briefly passed over the rows of attendees. If he recognized Ethan, he gave no sign of it. There was no anger in his face. No desire for revenge. No attempt to embarrass anyone. Only quiet conviction. The kind that survives long after pride fades. The seminar ended a few minutes later. Chairs shifted. Papers were gathered. Conversations resumed. People slowly filed toward the exits. Ethan remained seated for several extra seconds. Then he stood and walked toward the back doors with everyone else. Outside, the afternoon sun warmed the courthouse steps. The city moved around them in ordinary ways. Cars passed. Pedestrians crossed intersections. Life continued. Marcus eventually stepped from the courtroom and paused near a window overlooking the street below. The glass reflected his robe, the sky, and the distant movement of people going about their day. He stood there quietly for a moment before turning away. The sunlight remained. The city remained. And in the silence left behind, justice felt less like victory and more like understanding.